Hi, I'm Sadie Senator, and welcome to Inspirational Woman in Biotech and Medicine. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm so excited to introduce to you Jen Jarrett. Jen is the Chief Operating Officer at Arcus Biosciences. Jen, thank you so much for sharing your remarkable journey with all of us today.
Thanks, Sadie. It's great to be a part of the podcast.
To start, can you tell us a little bit about Arcus and your role at the company?
So Arcus is a development stage biotech company focused on the oncology space. So the fact that we're development stage means that we do not have a product that's been approved yet. So everything that we're doing today involves testing new oncology products and clinical studies. So we've got probably 14 different clinical trials right now across all different tumor types, from lung, pancreatic cancer, gastric cancer, renal cell carcinoma. So we're all keeping our fingers crossed, and we've got some big readouts coming from these studies over the next 12 to 24 months. So hopefully it's not too long before we will have a commercial product. My role at Arcus is Chief Operating Officer, and the easy way I describe what I do is I basically have everything that's not research or clinical development reporting into me. So that's everything from finance, investor relations, communications, program management, and then all the way to things like commercial and medical affairs. So it's a variety of functions. I have a lot of direct reports, but I love doing a lot of different things and jumping into different things when I'm needed. So it's been a really exciting role and a really fun time to be here at Arcus.
Yes, that sounds like an amazing role. And can you tell us a little bit about how your academic background led you to your current position and how it supports you in your everyday work?
Sure. So my father was a physician, so I always had an interest in healthcare. But at the same time, a lot of what I did academically was really focused kind of early on in math, which then became economics and then eventually finance. So I always had probably a lot of the bug to be in finance and business, but I always had, sort of a lingering interest in being in healthcare. And even when I was at Dartmouth, I started out doing pre-med. I got through about half of pre-med along with my economics major and just decided I didn't want to go into medicine. I really want to focus more on economics. So for about 3 or 4 years, I really didn't do anything in healthcare. I was in a totally different field. And then coming out of business school, fell back into an opportunity at an investment bank focused on healthcare. And it was just as the biotech field was taking off. And so even though when I started out in investment banking and healthcare, the idea was to cover all healthcare sectors, I just really kind of fell in love with biotech. And because there was so much activity within biotech, there was plenty to do. So kind of very early on, so this was probably 1999, 2000, I focused on biotech and have been focused on biotech ever since.
Okay, and how does working in the investment banking space compare with working in biotech and your job right now?
So investment banking is when you start out investment banking, it's a lot about analytics and putting together pitch books and doing a lot of things the senior bankers want you to do. But yeah, there's a lot of time on Excel spreadsheets and building company models and a lot of kind of math related work, which is what I really liked about it. Once you become more senior investment banking, your job becomes more about just kind of selling the firm. And so you become more like, a really well-educated salesperson. And I love that. I actually do love the commercial part of the business and less selling, but I just wanted to do more. And as the business was becoming more about selling and was more transactional, I think the role of investment banks changed a lot after the financial crisis. So I think our role became more transactional versus like having really a lot of ongoing dialogue and activity between us and a company. And I was just liking it less and less. And so I really wanted to go into a company where I felt like I could just get deeper into things versus I feel like banking, you're kind of mile wide and inch thick sometimes. And I wanted to be like much deeper and thicker and, maybe less wide. And I really love the idea of like being closer to biotech companies and actually working with clinicians and working with patients. And that's what I get to do a lot of here at Arcus. So that was really what drove the decision to leave investment banking and to go into a company.
Okay, thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. And when you were in high school, what did you want to pursue? Was it something in investment banking? Did you always know you wanted to be? I mean, I know you said that your dad was a physician, so was that something that you really wanted to do? Or how did that begin to shift as you went into college?
Yeah, I probably didn't know exactly going into college what I wanted to do. I knew that I always loved math and was always good at math. And then I started to really have an interest in economics and finance. Even in high school, there was no classes offered on that, but in history, I remember my last 3 years there, I got to make a decision on what we wrote about in these papers. And I always wrote about something that had to do with economics. So, I wrote about like the Great Depression and what caused it and, two other different topics. So for whatever reason, I just really kind of gravitated towards like economics and finance early on. And then when I got to Dartmouth, I went to Dartmouth, knew from day one I wanted to do economics, even though all these people were trying to talk me out of it and telling me that economics is like the hardest major and blah, 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 but that's what I wanted to do. And on top of economics, I also took like a fair amount of math classes and sort of did whatever I could to really develop my finance skills, even though being at liberal arts college, there's not accounting classes or things like that. And it wasn't probably to my senior year that I started to have more of an idea what I wanted to do, but to be honest, I left Dartmouth and didn't have a job. So still wasn't exactly sure, but it was that year I stayed at Hanover and worked for a small healthcare consulting firm. So that also got me back into healthcare. But I was seeing what all my friends were doing that had graduated, and a bunch of them went into investment banking. And I was like, that is exactly what I want to do. And from there, like started interviewing with investment banks, got a bunch of different offers and went into investment banking. So it probably, even though I probably knew earlier on than some that I really loved economics and finance, took me a little longer than some to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. But then it kind of hit me once I saw what other people were doing and really had a year to think about what I wanted to do for my career, that I wanted to do investment banking. And then stayed in investment banking for a very long time. Was in investment banking for about 20 years, which for a lot of people is a long period of time. A lot of people do a few years in banking and then move on, but I actually loved it and stayed in the field for a really long period of time.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm a very math-oriented person also, so it's really interesting to see how that developed throughout your college career. And how does what you learned from investment banking impact what you do every day as the chief operating officer at Arcus?
So a lot of what I do is dealing with investors. And so that's probably and making sure that we have plenty of money. Biotechs spend a lot of money. A lot of companies like ourselves are not selling anything yet. So we obviously have to raise money to fund the money we're spending. And so a lot of what I spend my time on here is investor relations and thinking about how to sell our story to investors. And then also just thinking about like how we're going to fund the company and raise money, as well as thinking about what kind of deals we want to do with other companies. And those are all things that investment banking is all about. So, I spent my years in investment banking working with companies, helping them think about how to raise money, what's the best format to use, how to best position themselves so they are in the best possible place to raise money, and then also helping companies thinking about transactions and partnerships. And so I probably spend about 50% of my time here at Arcus doing those things. But then there's also probably 50% of my time that's also spent on things that investment banking really had nothing to do with. And I've just had to pick it up as I've been in the industry. So particularly like I work in commercial and medical affairs and talk to clinicians a lot. And all of that is just stuff that I've had to pick up over the last 6 years and have spent a lot of time learning those skills and talking to a lot of others that have been in the field a lot longer than me, just to try to learn and absorb as much as I can and to prepare myself for those types of activities. But there was a lot in investment banking for sure that I learned that I was able to bring into my job at Arcus. And that's probably one of the reasons why they wanted to hire me at that point in time, was to have those skills in-house at Arcus.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, constant learning is sounds really interesting. And what has been the most rewarding part of your career or your job? And how does that inspire you to keep working every day?
So I really love the patient piece and the clinician piece, because clinicians are the ones that are actually treating all these patients. And that for me, by far and away, is what makes my job so rewarding. And I spent a little bit of time in Uber, which was interesting, but this is always what drew me to biotech, was really that patient piece. And especially being in oncology and cancer, and everyone has friends and family members that have had cancer. And we know like what a just terrible disease it is and how terrible the treatment options still are. And so I'm so passionate about what we do. And, our hope is to be able to bring new medicines that, not only help patients more, but also help patients without like all the terrible side effects that you always hear about with chemotherapy and other drugs. And so, I'm just super, super passionate about that. And, like I said, I love being able to talk to clinicians, just hear about their experiences with different drugs, the types of things that they think make a real difference for patients. And then also just, getting to hear from our patients and like what they're looking for and, what's a good experience from them. What are, it's interesting now with like the age of technology and digital media and everything, like patients are so much more informed than they've ever been. And they're out there looking for clinical studies like what we're doing. And so there's a whole new element to being in biotech that didn't even exist 15 or 20 years ago when people weren't on the internet all the time and there wasn't all this information that was accessible to them. So it's been a really fun time to be into the industry, to have like more direct access to patients, to be able to push more information towards them that we think is valuable. And, hopefully we'll be able to make a real difference in patients' lives based on everything that we're doing here.
The work in biotech is very impactful for so many people, which, that interaction with patients and clinicians. Do you have any specific stories of talking to a clinician or talking to a patient that really impacted you? Or is it just generally all of them together have just accumulated to something very meaningful?
Yeah, we've on the patient side, we've been having some patients come in that have types of cancer that we're working on. And there was one patient recently, I should say person with cancer, like we're trying to get away from using the word patients all the time. But it was a pretty young woman. I think she was early 30s and she had colorectal cancer, which is a lot of people have been hearing about, is really rising in incidence and younger people for some reason. No one, I think, really understands why. And this was like, kind of very classic situation where she had gastrointestinal symptoms for a while. Everyone kept dismissing it as nothing. And then, finally just had like a really acute event, went into the ER and then was soon diagnosed with colorectal cancer. And she's a young mom. She's been through many, many, many different types of treatments, is still doing relatively well. But, obviously when you go through all these different treatments, and when you go from one cancer treatment to another, it's typically because you've progressed, which is like obviously the worst thing that you want to hear from a cancer patient. So it was just really moving hearing her story about what it's been like just being on all these different treatments. And just as a patient, she talked a lot about chemotherapy and just how brutal chemotherapy is and how most patients are trying to find options like immunotherapy, which is what we're doing, that doesn't have all the side effects of chemotherapy, and where, patients feel like they go through all the stuff, but at least they have like a reasonable quality of life. And so it was a really moving story. And, people at Arcus were all in tears. And so that was probably, there's been many, many, many impactful things here. I was just yesterday spending the entire day at Sierra Canyon, which is a big cancer clinic in Tennessee, and just hearing what the clinicians are now excited about, what they're seeing in patients that are receiving our drugs. And it's just great just to hear firsthand from them what they're seeing, and just how our drugs are starting to make a difference for patients.
Definitely. That's amazing that they are making a difference. And I wasn't fully clear on the difference between immunotherapy and chemotherapy before. So that sounds really interesting because I have heard a lot about how chemotherapy really affects day-to-day lives for people. So that's amazing work. And then kind of on the other end, what have been some challenges that you faced in your field and how have you overcome them?
So I still think it's hard to be a woman. Fortunately in biotech, there's probably more of them than a lot of other industries, but investment banking, it was definitely early on, there's a lot more, but as you get more senior, there's fewer and fewer women. And, even on the company side, it's, and we deal a lot with investors. Most investors are still male. And so I still think it is, a little harder to be a woman. Always remember in banking feeling a little bit left out when there'd be a golf event or, a bunch of the male MDs would go to a bar. And, there's just things that as a woman, you feel like you can't do, to the extent that a man can. And investment banking, so much of it is about socializing and taking a client out. And it's a lot easier for a, 45-year-old male to do that than a 35-year-old female. And so I've definitely gotten much more comfortable with it as I've gotten older, but I do think it's a challenge that I think every female has that goes into business. And I think it's ebbs and flows. I think it's a period of time where a lot of women are going into business. For some reason, it feels like now it's less again for whatever reason, just post-COVID. But that's probably been the hardest thing, just like trying to feel like it's a level playing field and it's just as easy for me to interact and have dinner with a male client or a male clinician and as it is for someone at my company that's also male and, maybe viewed as like more of a peer to them.
Yes, that definitely makes sense. And it's interesting to see how that shifted over time to become better, which is definitely a good thing. And then kind of shifting into work-life balance, what does your typical workday look like? And how has that changed in your different roles over time?
Yeah, so I probably don't have a typical work day. I probably never have. There's just probably what I've liked about what I've done. It's like I'm that person that like doesn't like a lot of routine. I love it. Like every day is a little bit different. Every day starts at a slightly different time, ends at a slightly different time. Um, but yeah, I do spend probably most of my day in meetings. So either doing things on Zoom or in the office and meeting people in person. A lot of time answering emails. So when I have like short breaks between meetings, and usually, I have a lot of different things reporting into me, as I mentioned earlier. And so it's a little bit of a matter of like wherever there's a fire that day, that tends to be or that week, that tends to be the area that I'm spending a lot of time on that day. So if there's like something going on in commercial, some challenge we're dealing with, during that week, I'll just tend to spend more of my time, looking at things that relate to our commercial business, talking to those people. But then you'll have another week where we're thinking about raising money. And then, spending most of my time that week just thinking about investors we would target and how we would raise money. So, it all just kind of depends on what's happening here. But, like I said, it's what I've really loved about my role here. And I'm not sure I could do this role at a much bigger company where I get to do so many different things in the course of a day or a week. But every day is different. And I do get up early. I think that's a function of the fact that I was in investment banking so long, which tends to be on market hours. And I was always in San Francisco. So I'm usually up by 5:30 in the morning and love to start checking email early. And usually my first calls are starting somewhere between 7:30 and 8. But then being in California, things probably end a little bit earlier. So, usually like 6, wrap it up. And I'll do a lot of emails at night. Usually take like an hour or two off and spend time with my daughter. But then most nights, if not every night, I'll be back on email and just getting to things that I hadn't had time to get through during the day, or I have to look at a presentation. So I love having that alone time at home when it's a little bit quieter and there's not a lot of intrusion to get things done.
Okay, definitely that makes sense. You seem to always be on the move. And kind of going off of that, how do you manage your work-life balance? So I know you have a daughter, and so what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so probably means I don't have a lot of activities beyond doing stuff with Presley and my daughter and working. But but I try to do the best I can. I try to manage my travel more than I used to. I used to travel all the time and just didn't think about it. Now I try to keep my trips as short as possible versus before, I'd think, oh, I'm going to New York, I should try to get a million things done while I'm there. Now I go and I do what I really need to do there versus just trying to tack a bunch of things onto the schedule. So that's probably the biggest adjustment that I've made. I do think like post COVID, just being able to work at home more has made a huge difference, I think, for every mom. And I still try to go to the office a lot, but I don't like rush in like I used to. So I try to spend a little bit more time in the morning with Presley. Fridays, I tend to work at home. So it just means, I'm home when she gets home that day instead of seeing her at 5:30 or 6 o'clock at night. So I do think COVID and being able to work at home and do things over Zoom just make a huge difference. Try to take her to school a little bit more than I used to, or pick her up, but definitely see way more of her than I did before COVID. So it was a good wake up call, I think, for a lot of parents.
Yes, it sounds like it, and that's good that you're able to balance that time. And then my last question is, what piece of advice do you have for young women who are interested in the field of biotechnology or in business, banking, just any advice that you've accumulated over your years of work?
Yeah. So, I think the biggest thing for me has been always finding a mentor and just someone that really believes in you, especially when you're like starting out. But even later, I mean, I've just always been someone that's like to have that person around that I thought like really cared about my well-being and how I was doing and feeling about everything. And business can be tough. And, like I'm a woman that, I love my friends. I like people and, sometimes like just the ruthless parts of business can wear on you. And so I think just like having that person that you work with that, you can really talk things through, you can go to when you're like dealing with problems that are taking a lot out of you. Um, but all that stuff has just made a big difference for me. I remember, I had a boss who used to say a lot, I have your back, I have your back. And I think that's the best thing that you can hear from someone because it just gives you so much confidence just to know, like, hey, like this person is going to be there for me. Like if I do this and I fail, it's okay, versus having that fear, like, oh my God, I could do this, but what's going to happen if this doesn't go as planned? And is that going to be bad for me? So I think that's the best thing that, like, both women and men, starting out, I think can really be looking for is like, finding that person, either going to work somewhere where they know that person is going to be there, or like seeking out that person once they're working that can really be there for them and be a sounding board and will have their back.
Definitely. That sounds very important and is very inspiring to try and find those people. And that's part of this podcast, of course, to find people that influence me, but also, have my back and supporting me on these journeys. So that sounds like a very important piece of being successful in work. And you are such an incredible role model for me and for all of those interested in the field of medicine and biotechnology and business. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with us and share your inspiring story.
Also, well, thank you, Sadie. This was great. So thanks for doing this.